Hello, I'm John Speights. Welcome to the Veterans Roundtable. For this segment, we are very fortunate in having Mr. Dallas S. Burroughs as our guest. Mr. Burroughs lives here in Fuquay-Varina, and he's commander of the Tar Heel Chapter Number 1 of the American Ex-Prisoner of War Organization. Welcome to the Veterans Roundtable, Dallas.
Thank you, John.
In addition to that organization, I understand you belong to another one, which is the hat that you're wearing, the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor.
Right.
Dallas, could you briefly tell us a little something about the American ex-POW organization?
Well, the American ex-POW organization is an organization of American ex-prisoners of war that fought in any war. It doesn't matter whether it was World War II, World War I, Korea, or Vietnam. They're eligible to belong to the American ex-prisoners of war. Now, the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor membership there is exclusive to those who were fought on Bataan, Corregidor, and in some Guam, Wake Island, and New Guinea.
And Dallas, you have a magazine for each one of those?
We have a bulletin that comes with each one of them.
Both of the organizations do publish a journal?
Right, that's exactly right.
And I understand for the ex-POW organization, wives are also full-time members.
Right, that is right.
Dallas, you were serving in World War II at the outbreak of World War II, and you were stationed in the Philippines. The troops there were ordered to surrender on Bataan. You were in the Army Air Corps at that time. Mm-hmm. Could you briefly tell us where Bataan and Corregidor are located geographically?
Well, the Bataan Peninsula is a very small peninsula that juts out into Manila Bay. It forms one side of a natural harbor of Manila Bay, and of course Corregidor sits right in the mouth of that harbor.
Corregidor.
Yes, and of course the Bataan Peninsula is on the island of Luzon.
That's one of the main islands.
That is one of the main islands. It is also the island on which Manila is located, which is the capital of that whole Philippines.
And Luzon is one of the main islands.
One of the main islands, the northernmost island
of the
Philippine group. Yes.
Corregidor is a small island off the coast.
It's in Manila Bay.
Oh.
It's in Manila Bay, and it forms a natural fortification to protect Manila Bay.
Dallas, could you please tell us briefly what led up to the surrender on Bataan?
Well, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, of course, we had to fall back on Bataan, which was give us a shorter line to defend, and we held them for 4 months, and the Japanese, the first army that landed there was their casualties were so heavy that they couldn't take it, so they had to bring in another seasoned group of I don't know how many, several 100,000 men, and most of those were seasoned troops from the China campaign.
And you were low on supplies and
ammunition? Oh yes, we were low on food, medicine, ammunition, everything that was needed, and so many men were sick, and we were all stayed hungry all the time, just about all the time. But one of our biggest problems was lack of medicines. particularly quinine for malaria.
And then for the captured personnel, they were comprised of all branches of the American military. And there followed the infamous death march on Bataan.
Right.
There was only a small amount of food and water given to the prisoners. You marched in the death march. About how long did it last, Dallas?
Let me see. I have some. If I remember right, we marched for about 3 days and 2 nights. The death march, according to the was forced to march 60 miles, and about 10,000 American soldiers started off on this march, and
yes, here's some statistics.
yeah, well, you have
1,000 of the 10,000 prisoners died during the death march. 5,000 later died in prisons, labor camps, and prison ships, leaving 4,000 of the Bataan death march who survived the war. Some prison ships were unmarked, and some were sunk by American submarines.
right.
Dallas, did you personally see Americans killed during the march?
Oh yes, some were. If you were sick and you fell or lagged behind or something of something of that type, you were very likely to get shot or bayoneted or have your skull cracked with the butt of a rifle.
Did the Japanese officers try to prevent this?
No, they made no effort to stop this sort of thing.
Were any of them charged after the war?
Well, this I don't know. I know that General Hammer, who was later tried and hanged for his part in not trying to have a better organization to take care of the prisoners.
Well, so Commander Burroughs, you were a POW for most of World War II. Could you briefly tell us generally what happened and where you ended up as a POW?
Well, I ended up in Mukden, Manchuria, which is now called Harbin, and spent probably about 3 years up there. It's a very cold country.
That's in Manchuria?
Manchuria, yes. It's not too far from the Russian border.
And of course there were poor conditions. I believe, did you know of one person who was operated on for appendicitis without anesthetics?
Right.
And you personally knew that man?
Oh, yes, I know him personally.
During your time in the labor camp, were the conditions so bad that you would call it slave labor?
Oh, well, any labor you did was slave labor because you were not paid for any of it.
What type of work? Was it agricultural or?
Well, no, I was working in a machine tool and die factory. And there was, of course, they had some farm workers. They had electrical work, whatever needed to be done. They'd find out who could do it and put those men on those particular jobs.
During the war, Dallas, were you ever injected with hypodermic injections?
Oh yes, yes.
At the time that occurred back during the war, do you know what it was for?
No, we didn't know. I found out later that the Japanese were conducting in Harbin tests and experimentations on germ warfare.
I understand you have an article in one of your magazines.
Oh, yes, I have it right here.
And there were germ warfare experiments by the Japanese on prisoners, including American POWs and other medical experiments, gangrene and various terrible things happen to prisoners, in addition to just the germ warfare part. It has come out later, as we discussed earlier, and when I was looking through your magazines, Dallas, that in exchange for cooperating with America, with the Allies after the war, the personnel, the scientists and the people who worked on the germ warfare experiments and other experiments, or at least, or principally it's been referred to as the germ warfare experiments, I understand that they were granted war crimes immunity for cooperating with the Allies.
In exchange for the data that they had accumulated.
Mm-hmm. How did that strike you when you learned about that?
It made me pretty angry.
Oh, yes.
Naturally, I don't think that any of them should have been granted immunity from anything.
You don't think they should have gotten war crimes immunity?
No, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm. Dallas, when you were cooped up in the slave labor conditions for several years during the war, did you get much outside news of the war?
No, the only thing we got was rumors. And, of course, I can't tell you what kind of rumors they called them, because it would never be permitted on the air. But that's about all we got. There was no newspapers. Of course, any letters you got were censored.
Yes, Did you get Red Cross parcels?
Once. The Japanese had, the parcels were coming into Manchuria, but the Japanese were storing them up, and I'm sure that they were using them for their own use.
Well, when did y'all get them? Was that right at the end of?
Right close to the end of the war was when we when we got one parcel.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, that's too bad. You did hear at one time from your wife, though, something, didn't you, during the war?
Well, I got a number of letters from her, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And she would write quite often, but we weren't allowed to write, but a postcard, I believe one postcard every 6 months, and you were limited to, I think it was 10 words.
Oh, mm-hmm.
So therefore you couldn't, and naturally they wouldn't allow you to tell anything about conditions.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dallas, you and some of the other prisoners really experienced some harsh conditions. But I understand, I think we should mention one thing. If there are any conjurers or stage magicians listening, they might be interested. In spite of all the harsh conditions, you might even call it slave labor, when you were working there in the factory, some Japanese material just disappeared from the face of the earth, never to be seen.
Yes, we did an awful lot of sabotage.
And I understand this was heavy, big equipment, sometimes
yes.
in its crate. It hadn't even been uncrated, and here today, where did it go tomorrow?
It was buried in concrete when we poured a concrete floor in this factory. Thousands upon thousands of dollars of equipment was just disappeared into that concrete.
Yes.
And we became, another thing, we became very, very good at swiping food from whatever we could, whatever they had. We were almost sure to be able to manage to steal some of it. Excuse me.
Yes. Dallas, in a few moments, we can come in and get a close-up. You have a Japanese battle flag, I believe, and also a saber, which may have belonged to a Japanese non-commissioned officer. Later on, when we get the close-up on the flag, there's a lot of black writing on it, and could you tell us what that is?
Shall I stand up and show it?
Well, yes, if you want to.
This is a Japanese battle flag, and it was customary for the members of the platoon or regiment or whatever it might be to sign their names on the battle flag. Now, whether this was a sign of good luck or what, I have no idea.
And here's the saber.
Yeah, and this, of course, is a Japanese two-handed sword, they call it. And they love to come at you with these.
They were fanatics, you were telling me?
Oh, yes, they were fanatical. It wasn't until late in the war that some of them began to, as I understand it, some of them, they did manage to, some of them did finally decide that they would surrender along towards the last of the war on Okinawa and various other places.
Yes? You've been a very interesting guest, Dallas.
Well, thank you, John. And
Can you offhand think of anything you wanted to add?
no, not right offhand. I think we've pretty well covered it. I think most people have read about some of it, what little is printed in some of the history books, which isn't very much.
Our guest for this segment of the Veterans Roundtable has been Mr. Dallas S. Burroughs, the commander of Tar Heel Chapter No. 1 of the American Ex-Prisoners of War, and also a member of the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, which is what his hat refers to. Dallas lives in Fuquay-Varina. If there are any ex-POWs who haven't talked to him, they can call him at 552-4827. Thanks very much for being with us, Dallas. I might mention that if any viewers have questions or suggestions for future programs, they can write to us, the Veterans Roundtable address, and this is put on your screen during the program, P.O. Box 12743, Raleigh, NC 27605. I'd like to thank you again.